Okay. Hi, Rob. Welcome to the Explorer Poet podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. The reason I reached out to you originally, like I was saying before we started recording, was that you wrote this book, and it's called "Your Consent Is Not Required." It's just really was. Yeah, there you go. Your consent is not required. The rise in psychiatric detentions, forced treatment, and abusive guardianship. And this book and its title is the first thing that really jumped out to me. Um, and so, I reached out. But then there's this other part of the whole aspect of what you do as a journalist that also really interests me. And so, yeah, before we jump in, I'm just curious about, your background, how you became a journalist, who are you as far as your life story that led you to that, and what interests, what's the interest there for you?
Yeah, how I got into journalism. It is a bit odd because I never wanted to be a journalist, actually. It never even occurred to me early on. I worked in theater and poetry, did performance poetry, and I actually started making money at that, acting professionally and writing theater. And then after being out of the country for a little while, I was back in Canada, and I was looking around for what I might do next. And I just noticed there was an alternative news weekly where I was living. And I just found myself often reading these long form journalistic articles that I found really interesting. And at one point, it just dawned on me like, gee, I'd like to try this. Like, this form of journalism I kind of like. They were really these investigative features about the local community and what was going on in it. And so, yeah, the first couple things I pitched, the editor showed interest in, and I that's how I really got started in journalism. Was really, and what I loved about it right away was the community connection aspect of it, that I could, in this relatively small city, kind of started to become known. And so I'd write about something, and then people would bump into me or contact me in some other way and say, hey, you don't know the half of it, and kind of tell me more about this issue. And then that would lead to a new story. So making connections this way was an incredible way to get to know your community. And interestingly, that actually is directly related to how this book developed, because I think this is one of the reasons why national coverage of involuntary commitment is so poor, because I think you really need to see it on the ground in a community, and national journalists just aren't doing that, especially today, the way journalism has changed. So I think it really is important that I worked as a community journalist for decades, and that's where I really started to see how the mental health system was kind of penetrating every aspect of society in all these ways that you just wouldn't see if you were just kind of sitting in your office, high up in a tower in New York City or something like that.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of getting into it. And I think having done this podcast for a little while now, it's surprising how many people experience the same thing. It's something about the creative mind or the curious mind where you see other people doing something and you go, hey, maybe I would want to do that, or maybe I could enjoy that. Maybe I could add value in some way by doing that. In a sense, it's why I said, like I eventually said, I could start a podcast, because I was listening to so many conversations, great conversations taking place, and there were always questions that I wanted to ask, or like somebody would ask a question and I would go, I think I might have an answer for that, but you're just the audience listening. And so in a way, there's like this desire to participate and take part in the dialogue, or just the information that's out there. Coming like full circle in my life as far as my interest in things like depth psychology and the work of Carl Jung, I now see it as, especially in the creative person or in the sensitive person, there's like a real desire to add to what is in the collective, to influence the collective in some way, where not just, the group isn't just going along, but you're adding something new to help everybody keep questioning things.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, it's interesting to bring up Jung, and I mean, I'm interested in that sort of thread within psychology and psychiatry. Stanislav Grof, uh, was really influenced by Carl Jung's work, and the idea of there's these ideas of the transpersonal level of the human experience, right? And what are these common themes that we're all living through, and the ways we try to grapple the notion of the collective consciousness or the collective unconscious, and all of these things that I actually do think they're very relevant. Not in all these spaces, because in particular in this world of psychiatry and psychology, where it's being forced on people, often that thread, the thread that people like Carl Jung created, it's just completely ignored. It's considered like beyond crazy in a lot of cases. If you try to sort of cite that or turn to that, if you go to a psychiatric hospital expecting to get any kind of therapy along those lines, a way of reflecting on yourself, or a way of reflecting on society critically in some way and how that reflects in your own life, like forget it. Like this is just off the radar. All of that stuff gets pathologized in medical records, And so, I mean, I think it's interesting here, just the way we've stumbled upon this theme, right? Because it's really a polarization happening in our society right now, that where some of this richness that people are really drawn to in things like depth psychology is at the same time as it's becoming, actually, I think in many ways more popular in our culture, completely shut down in the dominant forms of psychiatric treatment that are actually occurring in our culture in institutions, right? Outside institutions, if you can afford it, you can visit a Jungian therapist, but you're never going to find one in a psychiatric hospital in North America today.
Yeah, I have my own thoughts about like why that may be, but I'm curious what you think. Where did this split? What is this split between the two, like the accepted mainstream version of psychiatry or psychology, and this other, which it almost seems like an esoteric form? It's kind of like outside the parameters of what's allowed. I mean, especially like you're talking about in North America, if it comes to insurance, it's definitely outside that. Why do you? I don't know. How would you characterize the difference, or why do you think there is a split there?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I bet we both have something to contribute in this, because, I think within the traditions of psychology and psychiatry, there's some analysis of that, is where intellectually did these breaks occur, and why are people like Stan Grof or Carl Jung sort of outsiders today, and why that's happened. But then there's a great book out by Robert Whitaker called Psychiatry Under the Influence, that kind of traces the history of it within the modern. It really happened in the past century, in the 20th century, where at one point, coming into even the 30s, 40s, 50s, psychoanalysis was still a very big part of mainstream treatment of individuals in any kind of distress. And then it was really the increased medicalization that took place in the culture, where the American Psychiatric Association essentially decided, okay, this is what we do. We've got all these psychologists and non-drug practitioners who are rising up and becoming more influential, particularly in the 50s and 60s. We have to define ourselves. We're going to be the medical people. And he kind of traces that history and how they then got in started to collaborate more with the pharmaceutical industry and got all of that extra backing financially. They started to lobby governments. Mental health laws then got written to be enormously medicalized. So now what we actually have is, under mental health law, psychologists and non-drug therapists, counselors, no matter what your training, you have no power under the mental health laws. Mental health laws give absolute power to physicians and psychiatrists, people with medical training. And so that was an actual lobbying effort on the part of these institutional actors to kind of make that happen. So that's politically why it happened, but there's probably a secondary story that's directly related as to changes in the culture and changes in the intellectual approaches on some of these issues.
Yeah, I think I follow what you're saying, and I see it very similar. You can see that there's this path, the medicalization path, right? And in a way, if you think about Carl Jung, he was trying really hard to be a scientist and to be medically driven, but he just kept coming up against this other aspect of humanity, of the psyche, where we're not wholly these rational beings. We're not wholly these biological creatures. There's some other thing, some other element. And a big part of it is, a big part of his psychology and his research was just reading myth and reading story. And in a sense, a lot of what the medicalized version of psychology wants to do is remove the idea that story has anything to do with it. They just want to be able to prescribe uh, and then offer us an immediate solution, a quick solution, something that doesn't require, the individual, because that doesn't allow the individual to just turn inward and solve the problem themselves through the analysis of their story in comparison to the broader story. What they want it to be is a pill that they can charge money for, and then that bring insurance into it, and insurance can easily give a code for a pill. It's much more difficult to give a code for, go home and sit with your emotions and
Yeah,
sit with
and
like that spiritual side of yourself. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, and sorry to mean you're up, but one of the things you said, I think was really important is around the role of spiritual thinking and spirituality in this. That definitely that is one of the splits that occurred, where in this increasing notion that, oh, everything comes down to the biology of the brain, we started to ostracize from that a more holistic spiritual kind of view of the mysterious dimensions of existence that we can't really pin down, that even today there isn't actually a biological theory of consciousness that's in any way coherent or proven, so that we're still with this very basic aspect of our existence, our awareness, our consciousness. There is no biology to that we know. We know the brain's related to it in some way, but we don't know how it's constructed, how it's created, how to remove it, that sort of thing. So yeah, and I think that was a big break, right? Because people like Jung and Stanislav Grof and all those people ended up going a little bit down that pathway, going, yeah, there's some stuff out here going on that seems really important that we don't really have biological correlates for, and it seems highly relevant, especially when we're talking about people's inner lives and what's important to them, and how they're going to live a fulfilling life on their own terms, and all of those kinds of questions. That it's no longer just a biological issue anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And in conjunction with that, just in the broader society, there has been a separation of just kind of a separation from what Carl Jung would, I think, term the symbols of our past, the religious symbols and the meaning making symbols. And so, along with the medicalization of everything, the kind of rationalization and institutional kind of medicalization of everything, along with that is also a cultural separation from the past in a way that it leaves everybody kind of in a tough spot. When you talk about North America, because you're from Canada, I'm down here in the United States. When you talk about North America and this issue of psychological health and the medical institutions' involvement, how can you talk a little bit about the differences between Canada and the United States? Or are they pretty in line with each other, or is there something of significance there that's different?
Yeah, one of the things I do in the book, and it is an American publisher, and a lot of the book, probably 70% of the book, is really focused on American stories. But I persuaded the publisher that it was important to keep Canada in there because of that point of comparison that it affords. And one of the things, it's so easy in the US context to start to blame things on money, entirely on money. And it certainly is a major factor in all this. Nevertheless, the Canadian healthcare system is largely a public system. There are fewer places in that system where people can really profit in the kind of way that they can in the United States. And so you see much more that it's motivated by something else. And so what we see is in both countries, definitely the use of forced psychiatric interventions is increasing dramatically, and has been for decades. And it's happening in both countries, and it's happening for many of the same reasons and in the same ways and with the same justifications. See, the only thing I found evidence of more in the United States was mass scale fraud. So the Department of Justice having to wade in when they're finding an entire institution incarcerating people against their will merely to bilk their insurance benefits. And although that's happened to Canadians, it's often happened to Canadians in a context where they were being coerced into coming to America, and that was a big phenomenon back in the 80s and 90s. But yeah, but it doesn't happen so readily in Canada today, although it is still a factor, because I try to remind people all the time, every hospital has a bottom line, whether it's funded publicly or funded privately or what it is, they have a bottom line where if their beds aren't filled, they start having financial struggles. So I do think it plays in everywhere, but that's the main difference. And I think it's just relevant to know that there's something going on in our culture right now that is really drawn to promoting forced psychiatric interventions. People believe in it in a certain way until they experience it. Most people I know who've directly experienced it themselves have a very different perspective on involuntary commitment.
So I want to get into what you think is the driver behind that. Like why are we moving in that direction? But maybe to take a step back to when you were first getting started into journalism, you said you worked locally for a couple of years. What was it that brought you around to the idea of investigating this as a phenomenon, or this as like an issue that needs to be spoken about? What was the kind of the impetus for your work here?
Right around the same time, it happened to my father. So here was a case where, my father had no psychiatric history per se. He was a career college professor of computer engineering and a good dad. I was actually there with them at the time because I'd been traveling. So I was spending a little time with my parents, living with them while I was kind of figuring out where I wanted to go next. And yeah, he fell into a difficult period. He had prostate cancer surgery, and it rendered him impotent and incontinent both. So devastating for a man who just recently retired and suddenly not have any sexual function and not able to control his bladder. It was very emotional for him, and preceded all by the cancer diagnosis as well. So confronting his own mortality and then his fragility. And so understandably, he was going through a difficult time. And at some point, he was certainly saying odd things, at times. I, with my background, like you, in depth psychology and things like that, I was just like, hey, it's all very understandable. Trying to sort of help him, but at a certain point, I had to leave. For work opportunity, and I kind of thought he'd be okay. My brother didn't feel the same way. My mother was a little worried about it. So they all agreed to go to a local psychiatric hospital for help. And it was almost instantaneous that basically they decided, oh, this guy needs to be locked up. And next thing we know, it's all spinning out of control. They're throwing 5 different drugs at him. He can barely stand. He seems to be getting worse and worse. They won't even tolerate notions of just letting him be there safely without any drugs. So, like, we're here to treat him. They start proposing electroconvulsive shock therapy. We're aghast. We don't, we start researching all this stuff, and it just basically spins out of control. For 9 months, my father got worse and worse and worse until we were all completely devastated. And that basically left me with this feeling of like, wow, if this can happen to my dad, who's like, well-to-do, middle class, educated, all this family support you'd want, all these things, voluntarily went there, like if this can happen to him, like who else is this happening to and what's happening to them? So really, it was only the second article I ever did or third article I ever wrote was on this issue. I pitched it to the editor, said, I want to interview people who've gone through this. Like, who else besides my dad has had this experience of being locked up in a psychiatric hospital? What was it like? What did they get better? What's going on? And the editor was very supportive. And so that's it. I just started to research it, and I interviewed people who'd gone through it. And it was just, the light started going on again and again and again, because when you really talk people who've been through this, certainly you see some where you go, wow, this person's really, really struggling, and it's hard for them to even make sense to you as they're talking and things, but you can kind of see how the drugs are just compounding it in some ways, just making them dysfunctional and drooling and all these side effects of the drugs that are brutal. And then you meet all kinds of people who either at the time or shortly thereafter are very lucid and very able to describe what they liked and didn't like and why. And that really just expanded my concern for this, because there's a caricature out there about people who get locked up, and it's a really abusive caricature in a lot of ways. And I found that rarely, very rarely, did people look like that or sound like that. And that often a lot of people, as I, the whole book is an exploration of who does this happen to, and it's an enormously wide range of people. And I discovered that basically quickly, so I'm not really jumping ahead in the story. Like immediately I was, oh, this guy was a professional logger for decades, and then just one night he wasn't getting a lot of good sleep, and he was kind of stressed out, and something really unusual happened, and then suddenly he's spinning down there and getting locked up. Or, oh, this is a young woman with a university college student, right, who's quite smart and engaging and all of that, and okay, it happened to her, and oh, here's a mother who's raised children, and it's happening. Like it was just, my eyes were really just sort of opening up to just how many people this was affecting.
Yeah, well, I mean, to have your own father go through that, it's got to be pretty eye-opening. Like, whoa, this is not at all how I'd expect this to go. And when I think about it, it's like, it sounds like he was having real struggles. Like he was having something legitimately happen in his life where, just like I said earlier, people have these stories and they're trying to live these stories, and then something happens in their life and the story shifts. That story is no longer available to them. And it sounds like that's what was occurring with your father, where, I mean, to go through that as a man, having that situation, it's at that point in your life, this probably at a point where he always looked forward to some kind of freedom and some kind of, kind of a way to have, in a way, I think people think about retirement and that period of their life as having more freedom and fun and more autonomy, just kind of letting loose in a way that they haven't been able to their whole life. But then to have something like that hit them, that's a huge shift in the story. And so it's perfectly reasonable for somebody to go through some hard emotional times, some hard psychological times. And it's probably not going to pass quickly. That's not something you just get over, because you're going to have to not only deal with the initial shock of it, but then also the ongoing adaptation to this new way of living. And that whole time you're going to have to go back and forth between what your story used to be and what it's going to be going forward. I just imagine that it's not a quick fix, and of course there's going to be some difficult times. But based on the way you tell the story, it's almost as if the doctors who saw the case, they just immediately said, put him on some drugs, because he shouldn't be behaving this way. He shouldn't be feeling this way. He shouldn't be acting this way. Whereas as a human being, it seems perfectly reasonable to go through something like that.
Yeah. And indeed, these were kind of some of the tensions that were going on even at the time. And in the conversations I was having with my father, like the sense of his struggle to accept the feelings he was having. And he spoke actually really in line with what you're talking about, right? Like the things that were really worrying to him and to my mother and to the doctors were things like, he'd say, the ceiling's caving in, the house is on fire. And you'd be like, no, the house is not on fire. And he'd be like, no, it is. He was always a bit of a stubborn guy. And he'd just like lock in on this, right? And I've got to call the fire department or whatever. And you'd realize, okay, there's a story going on here. And it was, right, the story of your own fragility and mortality coming up. That's how you're feeling. You're feeling like the roof is caving in. You're feeling like your house is on fire. Very understandable feelings when you just understand them in terms of metaphor. And my father had been a computer guy all his life, right? So Manu but he did have this interest in literature. So I'd remind him, the example I use in the book is like he was a fan of the book Crime and Punishment, which is all about a guy who plots a murder, right? He lives in this dark space, and he and it's like a stupid murder. It doesn't even, like, he has no particular motive other than to kind of express his own, frustrated life in some way by killing someone else, right? And then the ensuing darkness that precipitates in his life. So this incredibly dark novel about a dark person, I reminded Dad, like, and just think of that. I said, like, how much Dostoevsky, the author, must have kind of pondered those kinds of feelings in order to write a novel of that kind, to feel like that was a novel worth writing. And my dad would kind of get it for a bit, like, yeah, okay, maybe there is something here. Maybe I should go with this, but it wasn't his frame of reference. And that, is something I like to ask people. So, what would your answer be? I say, have you seen someone going through this in your own life? Have you gone through that, right? And what are the answers? Because for my father, I felt that he just didn't have the frame of reference ultimately to really strongly feel confident, like, yeah, that's a path I got to go down. This is the story of my life now. I'm a guy who thinks really dark thoughts. I think about killing myself. I think about murdering the people I love. And what does that mean? Why am I thinking that way? And to really explore, I think he was afraid. And so he did kind of go along in a way with the doctors just imposing that way of thinking too, like, this is bad. It's terrible that you even have that thought. It must be suppressed. Anything we can do to suppress it, that's what we're going to do. And if that means heavily tranquilizing you, that's what we're going to do. So to come back to that, have you seen that in different people in your lives? And have you noticed people reacting differently, depending on kind of their backgrounds?
Yeah, absolutely. When I think about it for myself, I don't know that I've seen anybody get to that level, but I can put myself, if you just try, if I try to just put myself in your dad's shoes, older generation coming from a different world where um, this idea of like mental health, it's like a newer thing, right? It's like this idea of going to therapy. Not in the past, if you went to a psychiatrist, it meant you were crazy. And now it's like you go to a psychologist or a therapist because you're trying to work through some things, or you're trying to figure something out, or you just want to, you want to feel better, you want to have less anxiety. And so it's like this completely different world of what the idea of that, even what the meaning of that even is. And especially if your dad is somebody who, for the most of his life, he's been stable. Everybody has ups and downs as far as difficult moments, but if he's never felt this dark before, if he's never felt this depressed, if he's never had something crash down on him like this, and these ideas of just, this is what mental health is, if you're saying these things, if these images are coming up and these phrases are coming out of you and you can't correlate them to something, then what is the answer? And the interesting thing about it is, we started off this conversation talking about the modern health industry and how they handle things through, pills and incarcerations and things like this. But that other route, that less mainstream route of depth psychology, it has terminology for these kind of things. And rather than saying you're crazy, you say things like, well, you're transferring, it's transference, or it's projection. You're just putting something inside of you out there. And it's a perfectly, once you're aware of what these ideas are, you can see almost everybody in every walk of life doing this on a daily basis, where they're projecting something inside of themselves out into the world, because it's a perfectly rational coping mechanism for difficult emotions and for difficult situations, particularly if you haven't come up in a world where you're encouraged to think about your emotions and sit with them and feel them and process them and let them burn up inside of you. On a grander scale, on a bigger scale, there's all this chaos going on in the world today. And a lot of that chaos is caused by people projecting outward instead of looking inward. And then you also see a lot of people jumping on these bandwagons behind different groups. And that also, this kind of activism, or even if it's in the real world or if it's online, it all seems to be the same thing of just projecting outward what you should be dealing with inside. And just the fact that you could go to a psychiatric center and there's not somebody there that can talk to you about that is pretty shocking.
Yeah, and you've hit really one of the main reasons that I get so aggravated when I read people's medical records when they've been committed, because you constantly see that doctors, psychiatrists refuse. They'll actively refuse, because sometimes they're even pushed by their own patients, but it often doesn't even occur to them, if they're not pushed, to to see the world in the way that you just described, to recognize their own tendency to project outwards and to do this very pathologizing that they've been trained to do, and to and the fact that they just don't question it. They just inherently do not question it. It's such a harsh way of viewing reality, and you can see how people get infuriated, especially if they're smarter than the psychiatrists, which they often are in my estimation, that they have a broader frame of reference for themselves, for society. They may be struggling. Don't get me wrong. Many people who get locked up are struggling in one way or another, but that doesn't mean that they're not like a dementia patient. You know what I mean? They're not like somebody who has no sense of the world. We know people labeled with schizophrenia often have extraordinary skill sets and can be successful mathematicians or scientists or artists and all these other things, and still be labeled with this kind of condition, let alone if we start adding in depression and anxiety, which are extraordinarily common conditions that people have and can still be very capable people in many ways. And so these are the people who are getting locked up. And I'll just constantly see in the records this way of the doctor just in no way recognizing what they themselves are doing, how they themselves are contributing to worsening the situation, how they're aggravating the patient. It's like, oh, like even when the patient's literally saying like, you people are driving me nuts, you'll see the nurses and the staff write in like, patient is externalizing her beliefs, right? But they're never doing it about themselves. It's like, it's a really almost scary level. And I think when you say what's happening on the social level, I think that's the best way to understand it, right? Because we see that across society right now. Is yes, people are very willing to externalize their beliefs and their attitudes and not self-question. And we get this clash, but that's a political clash, and at least we understand it, right? In an institutional context, suddenly, no, one person is supposedly insane and the other person is not. And that kind of polarization then can be very dangerous because it can strip one side altogether of their rights. It's as if, we took the clash of the Republicans and Democrats today and said, okay, well, one side is going to be ipso facto declared mentally ill, insane, and should be locked up, and the other side will have all the power, right? Like, we're dangerously close to somebody proposing that, I'm sure, and I've got examples of that happening on an individual scale. But I think right now, if you proposed it, people would say that's a nutso idea, that's super dangerous. Nevertheless, that's the kind of polarization that we talk about, that's standard practice in a psychiatric context, to say you're crazy, I'm not, that's it, I have all the power, you have none, and we're going to roll from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the word for it is like authority, right? Where somebody all of a sudden gets this authority over somebody else. The system gives them authority, their training gives them authority, whatever the government regulations are, they give them their authority. And it just, it's scary. In a way, it's very similar to an ideology or even a religion, you could say, because there's this structure, this institution that gives people power to say what's going on inside somebody else's body, inside their mind. They get to interpret the other person's experience for them. And in that sense, if it also becomes very rigid or dogmatic, because like you're saying, these doctors or healthcare professionals who are looking at the patient and they're not able to, in a way, identify with any of the patient's issues. They're not able to kind of put themselves in that place. And so they're just looking at it from the perspective of, this is the diagnosis and this is the treatment. But then also just describing the treatment. I mean, you talk about being locked up, being receiving, medication and pills. There's small spaces. You have to share spaces sometimes. Your schedule's managed by somebody else. And when I think about all of that, it's all counterintuitive to any form of mental wellness, where you need to maybe feel in a safe place. But what people probably really need for mental health is to be outside, to be in nature, to have freedom and autonomy, to have healthy people to interact with. And it all just seems counterintuitive to even the process of getting better. When somebody just is given prescriptions and they're swallowing pills, in a lot of ways, all it's doing is numbing them and kind of quieting them in a way that, in order to actually heal, to actually get over something, you need to interact with it and you need to process it. And you actually probably need to go through some really painful experiences. But it seems like this whole thing is motivated by this desire to not let them go through those moments.
Yeah, absolutely. It's considered illness, and we must suppress it and stop it as fast as possible, as hard as possible. And this is what it fascinates me. I don't know if that's the appropriate word, because it's profoundly disturbing, but what people are thinking of when they promote involuntary commitment more broadly in our culture, because I'm like, do you know what this is like? Do you know what it's like because people, I think they think that, oh, we're long past One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest or something like that. But no, actually, I was rereading One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest just the other day and going, wow, it's incredible how, in fact, they had more therapy back in the 50s in these large state institutions, because they were kind of more out of control because they didn't have enough staff for all these people. So all these patients were hanging out, and there was, anyway, the way he portrays it today, it's actually a much more constrained and harsh sort of environment in some ways. Now, certainly you can have a nice experience. Like, you can go there and meet a really respectful doctor at a good institution, and they say, hey, and they talk with you and they collaborate with you. And if you go along with things, it can be a fine experience for some people. But if you put up any kind of resistance, we're talking about the use of 4-point restraints, forced injections. There's security guards on staff who will overcome you physically. They force strip you. They use seclusion, lock people in seclusion a lot. As you described, there's dormitory settings. It's very unpleasant. Even my dad, at the first time he was brought in, he was put in a room with someone else. He had no privacy all of a sudden, this enormously private person who was reaching out for help. And he's just suddenly in this kind of sterile hospital setting with no opportunity to go outside, and with some young guy that he couldn't connect with at all. And and that's the environment. And then you start compounding it with these forced drugs and this sort of attitude that we got to stop this at all costs, like compounding his fear, actually thinking, oh my God, like they were afraid. They'd say, they actually tried to make me afraid. They're like, we've never seen someone as sick as your father. So I'd be like, really? Like, okay, I get it. He's an intense guy, but gosh, you work at a psychiatric hospital. Like, he just really was. I mean, my dad had 10 great years after this, right? So he really did not completely lose his mind. He was just going through a really unusual experience at the time for him. And it was a challenge, definitely. And he was talking odd. And that's what I try to say to people, like, you got to understand that this is not uncommon at all. So yeah, anyway, I want to say, like, it can be a really, really harsh and brutal experience, right? So not just, avoiding being helpful and nurturing and all that, but actually demonstrably the opposite. And I'm often aghast, like, how can you be a mental health professional and in any way think this is good? Like, I get it, some people truly are dangerous in some of these situations that they're in. They work in a big state hospital where they have actually murderers and things that are kind of being committed there, right? At that whole level, yes, it's a dangerous environment potentially. But average civil commitment, which is what I talk about in the book, is for law-abiding citizens who are typically nonviolent, people like my father, and yet even there, it's this incredibly intense, sort of harsh environment very quickly. And I'm like, how can you justify this? How can you think you're doing a good job? And I just don't know. And one of the things that serves me, and maybe you have a perspective on this from the people you've interviewed, I'm really aghast that, like, 20 years ago, psychologists, non-drug therapists of different kinds used to speak out critically about the mental health system in a way they don't do anymore today. It seems to me they've been bought off as well. And I would really like to hear more of those people kind of speaking out about involuntary commitment as a phenomenon, because it's still growing. And it's, for example, way more common in the school system now that a kid who's in distress or disruptive, it's a drop of the hat now. The numbers are becoming astronomical astronomical that teachers and administrators will call 911 and have the kid taken to a psychiatric hospital as a form of punishment or control. And I'm like, how can school psychologists and social workers like accept this? And have you talked with anyone about that? Do you have a perspective on why they might be going along with this to this degree?
No, I haven't spoken with anybody on, especially on that topic particularly, but to be fair, most of the people that I talk to, they're not part of this mainstream psychiatric system. You could probably tell just the way that I think and talk. Most of the people that I have on who are practicing therapists or most of them are psychoanalysts, which is they're on the depth psychology side. So most of them are graduates of some kind of Jungian school of thought. And so they're much more about, let's pay attention to your dreams and let's do some somatic work with your body and let's integrate into a place of wholeness. Why aren't they
speaking out? Why aren't they politically engaged, right? Because I'm saying to them, you are being wiped out. Right? Like your whole way of thinking, like, are they just perfectly happy to have their private little practice where, well-to-do people can come to them for therapy and they're content in that life, while the mass of the population is ending up, with no access to that kind of stuff, because that's what's happened, right? And they did used to speak. 20 years ago when I started this work in journalism, this is a state of journalism thing too. So 20 years ago, I could more readily find those kind of people to go, yeah, this is terrible that this is happening. And that has almost disappeared now. I can't get some of would the American Psychological Association take a strong position against forced treatment? With these therapists, like, dude, do you have any sense?
I don't have an answer. I mean, I see the situation in a sense. It's almost as if there really are two paths when it comes to psychology or people who want to go into this field. If you go to a traditional university I took a Psych 101 class, but I mean, I have a business degree, so I don't actually have a degree in this field, but I took a Psych 101 class and I think like a Sociology 101, and I just kind of very, very entry level into this. And all it was basically lists of pathologies and just treatments for those pathologies. So right away in universities, when you get into psychology, it's presented as, this is what it is. This is, if somebody's behaving in this way, there's some kind of thing broken with them. There's something wrong with them. And never did we ever cover anything about myths, stories, the unconscious, the conscious, the different aspects of that. We never talked about, the broader cultural and religious influence. We never talked about our separation from nature and how we're these evolved creatures living in an unevolved state. So yeah, we never got into any of that, but I think that most of the people who I talk to who end up as some kind of a therapist, they actually don't go that route. They go, because you can go, like, if I wanted to at this point, I could probably apply to one of these schools. Like I could apply to the school in Zurich that Jung founded, and I could apply to like Pacifica University and go straight from where I am and just go study in that form. But it's that separate from the mainstream path into the psychological world or the psychology world. And so I think that there may be a disconnect that's that big, because the people who are following this more, it's like a more of an introverted path to go look into depth psychology. And those people, I don't think they're not even getting that same Psych 101 class where here's a list of pathologies and what they all mean.
Right. You're affirming what my theory on it is as well there. Your Psych 101 class is actually really good evidence. That's my theory, that sort of psychology, even these non-drug approaches in the mainstream have largely bought in to the kind of pathologizing way of thinking that's closely connected to the biomedical model. That basically in the last 20 years, psychology has realized, hey, if we just kind of tag along with psychiatry and that medical model, that's the going thing. But if we tag along, we're going to make lots of money too. We're going to be credible too. We're going to get power too. So let's just go along with them. And that's what I see. Like if I look at a school mental health training program right now, it's almost like you start reading, and it kind of starts out really nice, like, hey, it's all about talking with your friends and supporting each other. And then you kind of a few pages later, it's like, but if they're sad for more than a week or two, you better get them to a hospital, get them on a drug really fast, and report your friend. Right? It's
Yeah,
literally stuff
that's
like that.
scary.
Yeah.
I mean, just that phrase "report your friend" is very much in line with that idea of like an authoritarian system where you police each other, and then eventually you're like policing yourself. And yeah, it's
Oh, it's
scary.
extensive.
Yeah,
It's extensive right now. This, like, kids are being trained to do it. And in fact, they're so trained to do it that it's like you're considered a bad person if you don't, right? And, we were talking earlier about just how common it is now for people to kind of see going to the mental health professional as an acceptable thing. And in fact, yeah, it's gone further to, if you're not doing it, there's something wrong with
yeah,
you.
yeah,
Right?
for sure.
And
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
where
yeah,
the authority kicks in here. And it's very frightening when that gets compounded with the level of power that exists under mental health laws,
yeah.
where now you can compel people into this sort of thing.
Well, we were talking earlier about this. In this, there's almost like this big shift, and you talked about money as part of it, especially in the American system. But you could see it working its way through a bunch of different things. So I think there's pharmaceutical drugs and pharmaceutical companies. There's insurance companies. But then even you brought up the educational system and how at schools, teachers and administration and even the nursing faculty, they're looking at children. They look at misbehavior. They look at kids who are a little too hyper, who can't sit still, fidget. They look at all of this in a sense as if it's pathological. And so for me, my own personal experience, I have a daughter who she had this challenge of like sitting in class. She's very intelligent, very smart, very bright, very artistic. But, she had a hard time focusing. She had a hard time paying attention. And so just going to the school a couple of times, I became irate with the environment, the teacher, and the authoritarian expectations of the teacher, and just this inability to see children as these developing creatures, as opposed to something that's already supposed to fit a system and behave in a way. And yeah, so you see it all over in the medical world, in the education world, in the pharmaceutical world, the insurance world. So what is it do you think, if it's not money, what is this push towards this way of approaching the situation, of approaching the problem? Do you have an idea or a thought that around that?
I do think there's a bunch of things, and person that I interview in the book, David Cohen from UCLA, raises the issue all the time. Like, if we really want to reduce the rising rates of involuntary detentions and commitment, we have to look at what are the institutional needs that it's currently fulfilling. So I do think there's a whole bunch of answers to that, many of which I explore in the book. Different institutions find mental health laws really useful for controlling people in certain ways. A great example of that most people will have heard about in some way and maybe just not quite connected it is nursing homes. So nursing homes now use antipsychotic drugs that were supposedly for people labeled with schizophrenia. They use them with almost everybody who ends up in long-term care. The numbers are astronomical. It can be 20%, 30%, 40% in Canada. In some cases, it's rising above 40% in certain institutions. So it's actually a worse problem here, but that's because there's been more organized efforts in the United States to try to curb it, because everybody, even in the mainstream, recognizes this is bad. This is a problem that we're heavily tranquilizing all sorts of people in long-term care really don't need it, and who would respond better to just sort of a better environment overall, a little more staff interaction, a little more therapeutic interactions that to deflate situations where they might be feeling stress, things like this. So everybody recognizes that, and it would often be cheaper even to do it the other way than to do it with the drugs. But drugs have become the predominant way to just control the institution. So it's that simple, right? It's just like, hey, we can do this. Everybody ends up just lying in bed all day, every day, because they're just so heavily dosed up. That's really handy for us who are trying to administer this institution, and everybody in a bed, we can bill for them. So that's just one. And so it kind of differs for each institution, how they're using it. But I do think it's part of a broader phenomenon in our society right now, that there's a rising authoritarianism across society. And maybe we could delve into why that's happening, right? All the cultural influences. And certainly one of them is the increasing polarization, lack of economic equity, which we've got greater poverty, spreading poverty, and all the stresses that come with that, all the difficulties, all the all the challenges, right down to homelessness and that kind of life. But even just for the average person who's just trying to live, the wages are so low relative to housing costs and things like that, that the pressures are enormous. So in that context, we've got a more highly stressed society. And in the midst of other things going on, we have this rising attitude of authoritarianism. And mental health laws are very appealing, just even more so than using police, because these laws are much more flexible. They still have the aura of, oh, we're actually doing something good. We're trying to help these people. So you can kind of justify it to yourself. But a great example of that is the best studies I've seen that have looked into 911 calls in major cities. So what's happening is people are very aggressively calling 911 on homeless people because they're just bothered by them. So they feel like, well, I'm not necessarily calling the police. I'm calling the mental health authorities, perhaps, right? They just have this sort of flexible notion in their own minds of what they're doing. And they don't just think, I'm punishing that person for being homeless. I'm punishing them because they're in a space I don't think they should be, and I'm going to get them, caught for trespassing. So they do it with that kind of attitude. And so, yeah, that's what I think it is. It's part of this growing sense that we're a society that's kind of becoming out of control, and people are turning to authoritarian attitudes to try to get it under control.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it seems like the going myth that is permeating the world today is control. And it seems like there's people, who knows if it's actual individuals, if there's some cabal, or if it's just the way of things, right? Where cultures, they form and they become very rigid, and then over time they slowly outlive their belief systems, they outlive their processes, and so then they kind of start to dissolve again. It would be great to be able to look at the Western world and think, oh, we can maintain this level of structure, this level of wealth, this level of peace for forever. But historically, there's no group of people who have ever been able to hold it together for that long. And I think that there's a lot of, like, this is just one example, and I think you're probably spot on as far as this. There's like some shakiness that's naturally going to occur in a society, but as the population continues to grow, and as things come around, like the COVID virus and the pandemic and the management of all of that, and as things come around with wars and with increases in poverty, homelessness, there's always going to be opportunity for somebody to seize a little bit more control, a little bit more control, a little bit more control. And then it trickles down, because it's just weird how systems work. And I saw this a lot when my kids were in school. Our kids aren't in school anymore. And this is one of the biggest reasons we do homeschooling, is that going to my kids' school and just listening to the way that their principal talked about things, as this is how we have to do it. And you're the parent, but you don't have a choice, because this is coming from the district, or this is, and the district is getting their information from somewhere, and they're getting their information from somewhere, their orders. It's like this authoritarianism trickles down, and everybody feels justified in behaving like an authority because somebody above them is behaving like an authority as well. And I almost lost it. I mean, there was a time where I screamed. I was on the phone with my kid's principal, and I screamed obscenities at her, because she was just behaving in such a, now looking back, I didn't handle that well. I probably shouldn't have screamed obscenities at my children's principal, but the level of ridiculous authoritarianism that I was experiencing, I was like, this is insane. Like, it's not your job to behave this way. It's your job to teach my kids some things to prepare them for their future. But yeah, you see it all over, and just to see it in how the whole diagnosis and prescription drugs plays out in both the medical world, but also in the educational world, particularly in the elementary and high school educational world, is pretty shocking and difficult to deal with.
Yeah, and a great example, the school system, where we have data actually from certain states and provinces where we can see that, yes, this is absolutely happening, that the school systems are, it's the highest, the most rapid rate is happening among children and youth of involuntary detentions under psychiatric mental health laws. So we know that, and we know that schools are one of the predominant places. The numbers really drop too during the summer months. So, what's going on there? And I can't help but think that part of it is that, well, teachers everywhere have witnessed, like, gosh, if we fight for smaller class sizes, right, and other ways that they might try to manage a disruptive classroom better, it's a hard fight. We have to picket, we have to protest, people hate us, the government comes out against us, all that. But gosh, somebody is now funneling tons and tons of money and services. This whole notion of mental health supports really is a going thing out there, and it's really easy for teachers to go along with that and go, okay, well, this is another solution. If I've got 3 kids in my class who are just the ones creating the most ruckus, I can either go out and picket for months and try to get smaller class sizes so that those 3 kids are easier to manage, or I can get all 3 of those kids taken to a psychiatric hospital, probably put on a drug in no time, and they'll become a lot more docile and easier to work with in my classroom. Well, gee, what are you going to do, right? And then especially if, in fact, as you've described this in this authoritarian hierarchy of structure, they're being told to do this. They're being ordered to do this. They're being told. Like, I've talked to social workers at schools who say, yeah, 20 years ago, I was the person who would interact with those disruptive kids and find out what was really going on in their lives and kind of do therapy with them. Well, that's not allowed anymore. If this kid so much as expresses anything remotely violent or anything remotely suicidal, boom, I have to check a box, and they go to the psychiatric hospital, to the psychiatrist. So this is the social worker themselves, even if they don't personally think that's necessary. They think, oh, this is just something the kid's saying to kind of express his feelings. He's having trouble at home, and that's what we really got to get at. Even if that's what they're thinking, doesn't matter. In a lot of cases, they've got this command coming down from above, that it's an interesting decentralized command. It's not like it's a central authority that says, in all cases, do this out there, right? But it's like a decentralized form of authority that's related to certain types of feelings and behaviors overall, that says you should do this, and people are obeying it. And that's definitely part of this phenomenon.
Yeah. Yeah. And part of it is just this decentralized idea. That's how a lot of authoritarian regimes work, because in a sense, everybody's just trying to keep their job, right? They're just trying to please whoever's above them in such a way that they're not going to be reprimanded. They don't have to risk the threat of, being fired or let go. And so in a way, people just feel like they're, doing their job. And yeah, it's scary. And it's, I don't know. What do you, coming away from it, having written the book, spent all this time doing the research and kind of seeing the situation, what do you feel like can be done or what should be done?
Well, yeah, that will circle us back to the state of journalism in North America. I'm really concerned about it. I wrote the book for a reason, hoping that, okay, like, I could see it was a complex set of issues, and it needed a book to kind of really explain how all these different issues fit together. And so then I hope that other journalists and other people would really connect with that, and that we would kind of see maybe that it could at least contribute to a shift in the public dialogue around that. But what I'm really seeing is really the exact opposite. Even though this book has gotten the attention, of lots of people who work prominently in the media. I know that because I've been in communication with the publisher who's asking for free copies of the book and getting it who works in the media. So I know it's reached a lot of those people, but they aren't really covering it. And what we're largely seeing is both governments and news media are continuing to promote this agenda of force. And that's even, it's not just me they're ignoring. I got to say, right, it's all these patients, the millions of patients that are having this happen to them. And they're also ignoring even now the World Health Organization that has come out in the wake of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The World Health Organization has come out with a collection of guides saying, we got to get coercion out of mental health care. It's not helping anyone. There's no science to back this up. It's clearly just for policing and control and not truly for health care, mental health care purposes. The World Health Organization has now fully embraced that attitude and has issued all kinds of guides to strike forced treatment out of mental health laws and guides to all aspects of how society works, to say, here are ways you can have a non-coercive approach to helping people who are in distress, to help people who might be expressing violent feelings and all of that. So that's out there, and they're being ignored. Right. So it's not just me, right? That's what I'm trying to highlight here, that there's this huge tendency going on. And that really concerns me. That concerns me a lot, because I do think this is what we need. Like, we absolutely need more people talking about it, more people aware of it, more people understanding what involuntary commitment really is. Because when they do, I don't think they're going to be so apt to promote it. And also when they understand how broad these laws really are and how easy it is really to subject potentially you yourself, your family, your children, your parents, that's someone close to you that you care about, that you don't think should be treated this way. These laws are so broad that they can really capture a lot of people potentially. I think people need to understand that. And then that, I believe, would precipitate a shift. So it kind of goes back to some way, that authoritarianism also functions in this lack of awareness, this ignorance that people kind of willingly embrace to some degree. And I think that's what's happening right here. People don't really want to see this darkness in our society, and consequently that's feeding this. So if you ask me what we need to do, I'd say that's the first thing. We really need to raise awareness about what's actually happening. There's a narrative out there that's false. We actually have more beds than we've ever had. We have more people being involuntarily treated than we've ever had. There's a narrative out there that's completely false, and all of this data and information resources are in my book and on my website and all of that for people to see. But we need that awareness. And then what comes with that, just so much. And I think that really the kinds of things that you're talking about are an important piece of that puzzle, to have a broader view of the human psyche. What are we grappling with? What is happening? What are these challenges all about? And how can we reframe and understand in new ways that story of what's happening inside ourselves, and kind of support each other through that process? I think you've talked about mutual aid, a little bit. And so have I kind of volunteer a bit in that area and do some work in that area around people coming together to help each other in different ways. And I think human connection, I hear this all the time from people who've been locked up. They just needed human connection. And still today, they really want that human connection. And a therapist can't really give you that in the end, because they're not your friend. They're a paid advisor, and that can be useful sometimes for some people. But what people really need and want is they want genuine connections. They want to be able to have conversations like you and I are having right now, where they feel free to say, hey, you know what? Yeah, I've woken up and I feel suicidal. And it's like, oh, okay, let's talk about that. That sounds like a really difficult feeling, and let's go from there together. Not like, oh my God, you're a threat, you're a danger and all of that. So I think it's a huge part of it, and yeah, so I want to affirm that kind of work.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like you're saying it's this idea of the first step is always just acknowledging that there's a problem, and just accepting that the way that we're approaching, first of all, like, there is a problem that needs to be solved, but the way that we're solving it also is perpetuating the problem. And we just need to be a little bit more human with each other.
Oh, it's incredible how healing that can be for people. It really is. I think we all should be more aware of that in our daily lives, but I hear it from people who've been in these extreme states too. When I say, okay, what would have really helped you and what helps you now? And why is it different for you now as compared to when you were getting locked up and things? And you'll hear this all the time. It's just like someone that people in my daily life, right? So not just the professional therapist, but those people in my daily life that I feel like I can be honest, I can be open, I can be myself with them. And there's a way in which whatever, they're just my friend. They might agree with me, disagree with me, accept me, not accept parts of me, and say I disagree. But there's a genuine sense of sort of commitment to the relationship, I guess, right?
Yeah.
And also to express your own limits, right? To say, hey, you know what? Like, I don't have this much time for you. And that's something I think people need to learn, that they aren't being taught in the mental health system now, because there's this funding that's paying people to listen to them, right? And so people need to learn sometimes, you know what? Yeah, sometimes when you express darkness, it'll tap your friend out. Your friend will go, I can't handle it. And that's a good learning. Sometimes you go, you know what? Yeah, maybe the way I'm expressing this is hard for people. Why is that? And what can I learn from that? And do I accept it from others? And how readily do I accept it? We can learn a lot from where we're willing to go in conversation and what makes us uncomfortable, and to keep expanding those boundaries, providing support to each other in that space. And I honestly think just good friendship is really what we're talking about, not some fake form of support, but just honestly feel like, hey, I hear you, I hear your pain. Yeah, I get that. Does you know what I mean? That sense of true understanding, mutual understanding.
Yeah, I absolutely know what you mean. Just in my own life, I've done the therapy thing, and I never had any medication, but I tried the therapy thing, and I got to a point where I was like, oh, this person who's sitting across from me, I can't go much farther with them. But then just doing something as simple as this podcast, where I have people come on, somebody like you, and I have a conversation where I get to share a little bit about myself, and I get to hear, a little bit about you. And then we talk about interesting subjects. Just finding ways to do that through media like this, but then also just finding ways to do that with people in my real life through groups and events and meetups, where you're just looking for other people who can have that kind of an interaction. And it's really changed my life for me. It's like changed who I am. It's allowed me to just be more tolerant of my own inner world, and also my interaction with the outer world. And yeah, I really do think that it's important. Well, I think that what you're doing as far as the research, and as far as writing books like this, just bringing this awareness to the public, is really important. And yeah, I'm really grateful that you took the time to chat with me today. We're up over our hours, so I want to be respectful of your time. But you shared a lot of great information. It's been really, the time just flew by, because it's like interesting and it's important, and I appreciate that. Before we jump off, where could people go to find your book? Do you have a website, or are you on social media? Where can people find you?
Yeah, yeah. The best way to find me is my name's fairly unique, Rob Wipond, Wipond, and you can find my website there. Link to the book is available anywhere. Your consent is not required. The rise in psychiatric detentions, forced treatment, and abusive guardianships. I'm on Twitter most actively. I find there's more engagement there for me there. Twitter X, as it's called now, and a little bit on Facebook too, but not so much there. And yeah, and you can always contact me through my website as well. There's a contact page there.
Okay, well, awesome. I Thanks again, Rob. This was great, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a great conversation. Appreciate it.
Okay, bye.